Welcome back to the Golf Fitness Bomb Squad. My name is Chris Finn, and I'm your host, and I'm excited today to get into the third part of our four-part series on the Core 4 transfer training principles. So if you have missed the last two Fridays, super quick episodes, hyper-focused on one of the four training principles. If this is the first time that you're hearing, maybe it's the first time you're joining us, welcome. Thanks for checking us out. Would highly recommend going back. So I guess it would be 2 episodes and 4 episodes because we do 2 episodes a week. It's been each of the last 2 Friday episodes. So if you're listening to this one, skip the one prior to this, listen to the kind of every other one on the way back. Quick reminder for those of you who are on this Core 4 transfer training principle journey with me. Remember, you have to pass all the mobility for any of this series to make any sense. Actually, it'll intellectually make sense to you, but in order for you not to hurt yourself, so really for it to make sense for you to try this stuff, you have to pass all the rotary centers. I guess I'd be okay if you didn't fully pass the neck, but you 100% need to pass the hip rotation test on both sides and the shoulder rotation test on both sides. And in particular, today's topic, you need to pass the trunk rotation test, the thoracic spine test, okay? So that's the mobility requirement. The strength requirements, if we talk about all the basics foundationally, you need to have the strength in your lower body to support the actual golf swings so that you can get to your lead side, which is the first of the Core 4 transfer training principles, right? You got weight shift was number 1. That was what we talked about episode 1. Episode 2 of this series, we then talked about the hips, making sure the hips lead the transition. It is possible. I've seen people weight shift correctly, but then have their upper body lead the transition. No bueno. Okay. You need to create that weight shift. Remember, we talked about the weight shift board in that first episode. So you feel that push down to the lead side at the top of your backswing or the beginning of your transition. Then we have the hips leading that transition after that weight shift. So remember, we talked about the band wrapped around the waist, pulling that band to create resistance. Basically, you're pulling the band away from the target so that you have to lead the hips transition against the resistance of the band. The third transfer training principle is X factor stretch. Okay. Now, this is a concept that gets confused, talked about incorrectly. People don't actually understand what it is, right? People will say people talk a lot about X factor, and there's a difference between X factor and X factor stretch, okay? X factor is a static measurement, which measures how open or closed basically, we can say it open and closed if we're talking relative to the target, or we could just say, how many degrees of rotation, one way or the other, your shoulders are. So let's use a right-handed player as an example. If I'm square to the ball, my shoulders or my spine would be rotated, let's say 0 degrees, and my hips would be rotated, let's say 0 degrees, okay? There's no X factor, right? Because there's 0 and 0. If I start my backswing and I get to the top of my backswing and I have turned my shoulders, let's say 60 degrees, and I've turned my hips 30 degrees, that means I have a total of a 90-degree turn. I have a 30-degree X factor, right? 60 minus 30 is 30. So I have a 30-degree X factor, but the 60 plus the 30, 60 from the trunk and 30 plus the hips added together means in total, it'll look like I turned 90 degrees. So it'll look like my shoulders turned 90 degrees, but actually 30 of those degrees came from the hips, okay? So X factor is that static measurement. At any point, we can measure X factor in the golf swing. So we could say at address, you had a 0 X factor of 0. The top of your swing, maybe you had an X factor of 30. X factor stretch is the rubber band effect in the golf swing. This is what you see in all the tour players, particularly younger junior players, especially you see this. Golfers who don't have any mass on them have to use this in order to create speed, right? So this is what the X factor stretch is at the top of that backswing. You were at 60 degrees of spinal turn, shoulder turn, and 30 degrees of hip turn. As I start to, if I complete the Core 4 transfer training principles. If I complete the first 2, where I weight shift to my lead side, in this case, we're talking about a right-handed golfer. So if I weight shift to my left and my hips lead the transition, and then I start to clear open my left hip or my lead hip, let's say now my hips are rotated. Now, they've rotated, let's say 30 degrees back to where they started. But let's say I've actually kept my shoulders back, right? So now I have 60 degrees of shoulder turn, but my hips are back to 0. Now I have a 60-degree X factor. My X factor stretch, though, is 30, right? Because I had 30 at the start. I've created an additional 30 degrees of stretch. Think of that is stretching the rubber band. And then we shorten that stretch, right? That rubber band shortens. That's what fires that upper body and the arms and the club and all that coming through really, really fast. Okay. So that is what X factor stretch is. So a lot of people can do the weight shift. They can lead the transition, but maybe they don't create a stretch, right? Everything just kind of comes together. If they start with a 30-degree difference between shoulders and hips, they just maintain that the entire time. They don't get an actual stretch element, which is particularly in the older population. So a great drill for this, number one, is we have to make sure that you can disassociate. So we're just going to do that for today. We're going to talk about very simply, if you struggle creating this X factor stretch where the hips start and create that rubber band like effect in the downswing, right? If you're struggling with that, we need to make sure you can disassociate. One of the simplest ways to do this is you stand in golf posture, no club, just put your hands on your shoulders and just see if you can rotate your hips around without your upper body moving. And then try to keep your hips still and create shoulder turns, like backswing, through swing turns, just with your shoulders without your hips moving. More than likely, if you don't have X factor stretch, you're not going to pass this test. In which case, one of the easiest drills to do is get into a door frame, push your hands against get in golf posture, push your arms against the inside of the door frame to keep your upper body still, and work on just getting your hips moving without your upper body moving. Okay. And then you can actually, but if you have somebody with you, that's helpful to have them hold your hips, and then you try to do shoulder turn and get the feel of what it feels like to disassociate your upper body from your lower body. Okay, so this is probably the main episode. Why I wanted to break this into 4 individuals is because there's a lot to unpack here. You might want to go back and listen to this a second time, maybe a third time, just to understand the difference between X factor and X factor stretch. And the third transfer training principle is improving your X factor stretch, right? It's not necessarily improving your X factor. It's the X factor stretch, right? So you could get to the top of your backswing and really only have 20 degrees of difference. So let's say we'll use this example. Somebody gets to the top of their backswing, they have 20 degrees of X factor, right? Their upper body is 60 and their hip turn is 40 to their back. And you have another person, let's say is our first example, right? They go 60, but they only get 30 degrees of hip turn. If that person with 30 gets back to 0 and they create a 30-degree X factor stretch, and the other person who had 40 degrees of hip turn only, let's say that maintains that 20-degree difference and their X factor stretch is 0, even though they had more turn, they actually will probably swing the club slower because they had less X factor stretch. So they're using the X factor stretch less efficiently. Now, do they have the opportunity to create more X factor stretch? Heck yeah, they do, because they have more mobility, but you have to be able to control that mobility. And that's, we go back to A, do you have the mobility? B, do you have the strength, particularly in the rotational facet. This is where I really love the flywheel training. We use the K pulley trainer. That is a great tool to improve your strength and your ability in the feel to feel the disassociation and create that X factor stretch. So a lot to unpack there. Go back, re-listen if you need to, and don't miss next week because we're coming back with the 4th of the 4 transfer training principles to wrap up this series. Hopefully you're finding this super helpful. And as always, definitely, if you haven't already, grab the home assessment below because you definitely need to make sure you have the mobility before you try this, because please do not hurt yourself. If you start to try to do these drills and you don't have the mobility, you will be calling me, asking me to help you fix your back pain. Please don't do that. I mean, if you do hurt your back, yes, call me, but please don't get to that point. Prevent that from happening. And that's the whole goal of this pod, is to help diffuse injuries before they happen. So thanks as always for hanging out with me, and we'll catch you next week.